January 1st, 2023, I made a video stating on how I thought there was going to be a Gear 6 in the future based on recent events that could be coming ever more closer. As based on what we see in chapter 1127 and in chapter 1129, Gear 4th as we know it has been eliminated. It has been cannibalized by the base set, much like Gear 2nd and Gear 3rd before it, after the time skip started. This is a very, very interesting development because what I had forgotten about Gear 4th was that it went under a very subtle but a very important transformation as the addition of Conqueror's Haki changed the entire move set for Luffy. Therefore, Snake Man attacks like Black Mamba were changed into Gum Gum Hydra. And then the Gear 3rd attack, Red Rock, has a variant called Rock Gun. So, with that being said, we open the idea of Gear 4th being cannibalized with an entirely new attack in Gum Gum Elephant Whip. Gum Gum Elephant Whip is described as a Gear 4th technique. This was interesting to me from the jump because, of course, if you don't know, in the post time skip, and this is really weird, there aren't any Gear 3rd kicking attacks as far as I know. And I have checked, there aren't any, which I always thought to be really weird because in the pre-time skip, there were a few. There was at least Whip, right? And I believe Axe, but never, ever in the post time skip. All the elephant attacks were always punches. So elephant gun, elephant gatling, etc., right? So that's just super weird that we open in Elbaf with a Gear 3rd style kick that's actually Gear 4th. So with that being said, I think this opens up for a wide realm of possibilities in the future. Because, for example, now, seeing as how Gear 4th, and by extension, I would think Gear 3rd and Gear 2nd are all now just one thing, seeing as how we have a Gear 3rd style attack under the banner of Gear 4th. Now we can start thinking about, well, what about all of the Snake Man stuff? What about all of the Bound Man stuff? Because as of 1129, we have base Luffy using Kong Gun. So now that opens us up for even more interesting combinations. Like, what if there's and this is weird, but I wonder if this would ever happen. But what if this leads us into Hawk style techniques done via kicking? I wonder would that clash too much with Sanji? Because, Sanji's the fire kick man. So it's going to be interesting to see if that ever comes to fruition. Because what's interesting about this too is that we don't have, like, say, another variation of Rhino Schneider, which is a Gear 4th technique. And I think too, just speaking about Gear 4 stuff in general, I wonder, can Luffy now fly in base using the propulsion of Gear 4th? Because why wouldn't he be? Because it's just Moonwalk. It's just Geppo, right? Just his version of it. So that's something else to think about, seeing as how Gear 4th is cannibalized by the base set. And now think about the big ultimate attacks like King Cobra. Can he now do King Cobra in base? And furthermore, what about King Kong Gun or Kong Organ or Kong Gatling? These things too should be possible. Leo Bazooka, that should be possible. What even about, what was the big version? There was a big movie version I believe he did on Gil Tizarro in Film Gold. It's like a King Kong version of Bazooka. That's a possibility. You kind of get what I mean? There's just so much to go into. And seeing as how now you can have things like Jet Culverin be done in base. Because why not? It's such an interesting thing to think about. All these things are now just available all the time. And this is such a big deal. But I don't necessarily think that means that the transformation of Bowman, Snake Man, Tank Man are gone. I just think, as I've said in the Gear 6 video and the video in which I called that this would happen, that Gear 4 is being cannibalized by the base set, I think we'll get a return to form designation in Gear 5th, and that's what our Gear 6 is going to be. I strongly think that, because Gear 4th is primarily based on its mode switching, therefore it's based on its proportion control. The one form that specializes in proportion control is Gear 5th. Like with the whole meme that came out when Gear 5th got animated, when Luffy goes, "Monkey, monkey, monkey," or "Monkey D muscles, muscles," right? He looks like Gear 4th Bound Man when he gets muscular. And then he's had a balloon state before when he inflated Kaido and he looks like Tank Man. And I've talked about this a few times. I even mentioned it on the podcast. But it's really interesting to think about how Gear 4th, like 3rd and 2nd, even though in their respective time periods of being new, they're all described as transformations, there really aren't that transformative when you really think about it, compared to Gear 5th, because now that's the measuring stick. Always compare things to Gear 5th, because Gear 5th gives Luffy totally new abilities. You have defense nullification, because he can turn people into rubber. He can turn the land around him into rubber. He can grab things and turn them into rubber, like turning lightning into rubber. He has some sort of hammer space tune force abilities in which he can turn his hair into goggles, make a paint bucket and brush appear out of nowhere. Just several little things like that. Also materialize a helmet, which was super weird. And I guess we'll get a strong clarification of what that was when it's animated. But so we'll see about that. But it's just interesting just how many abilities are available to Luffy in Gear 5th. But you look at the forms that came before that, they're not even forms, because they don't really change anything that Luffy has already. It seems that way, but it's really not. It's just elevation of what he can already do. Whereas Gear 5th is actually additive. It adds abilities to him. Because when Gear 4th, what Gear 4th really does, it gives him a defense boost, because that's the only form, I guess you could say, or the only method that he has had so far that's truly defensive, and it can shore up a classic weakness that he has had since the start of the series, which has been cutting, right? That's cool for Gear 4th, but the funny thing about Gear 4th is just how much of the 6 powers appears to be in Gear 4th. It is mainly just Soru and Geppo, Shave and Moonwalk. Because the flying is Moonwalk. I guess in a way, because of how the Haki is, you can say there's a bit of Tekai in there. I guess you could. Also, as an aside, I'm wondering, does he have a special relationship to Haki? Because it's weird now that so much so it was mentioned in both the Cracker fight and the Doflamingo fight that his application of Haki was different, because he was both hard and soft at the same time. Or hard and rubbery at the same time. So I wonder if that's just a thing that happens to him, and that now is not special anymore because now he's using Gear 4th in the base set. So maybe that wasn't a very special thing the entire time. It's just that so much surface area of him was being covered with Haki at once that it had that effect. Something to think about. You could even say, based on just his physiology and seeing the whole bit in action, you could even say that there's a bit of paper arts going on because of the proportion control that he had to force upon himself Whereas in Gear 5th, that's just an ability. He can just do it naturally. So that's kind of interesting to think about. Is he using air control in combination with what he saw from the CP9 guys in paper arts to make Gear 4th happen? I don't know. I just think there's a lot of 6 powers in Gear 4th. And then the whole zigzag maneuver called Razor that Lucy uses. That's all what Snake Man's about. Because the funny thing about Snake Man, and I can't remember who said this. There was a YouTuber who said this. He's absolutely right. Snake Man's not about speed. People often think that's the speed transformation. It's not really the speed transformation. It's the stretching transformation. His attacks gain in speed when he stretches. So it's not so much about speed. It's about range. It's about elongation, which you see that because all during Snake Man, his limbs move in zigzags, much like how Lucy's body moves when he's using Razor, which is a combination of shave and moonwalk. So that's just interesting within itself. And it's also very interesting why I'm excited to see what happens in this supposed Gear 6, because if Gear 6 is just Gear 5th with the Haki usage of Gear 4th, it's going to be interesting to see the mode switching that goes on, because there wasn't any mode switching in Gear 4th. You would have to completely go out of a form and then go back into Gear 4th with the intent of going into, most likely, most of the time it was Snake Man or Bound Man. So with that being said, with Gear 5th and how fluid Gear 5th is with Luffy's form, he can go from Bound Man to Snake Man and back into Tank Man, maybe. Because now thinking about it, Tank Man, based on Luffy's ability to gigantify himself, might change or might be something different, seeing as how proportion control is just second nature in that state. So it's really interesting to see where things are going to go. And in terms of like keeping stakes high, I think that's where all the stakes are going to go. The stakes that we see from Gear 4th and the stakes that we see from Gear 5th are probably going to go into this supposed Gear 6, because I can't see narratively how much sense it would make for Gear 5th to constantly be a point of exhaustion for Luffy moving forward. What might bring that back into the forefront is after he gets over his exhaustion from using Gear 5th, and that's no longer a factor, we have this Gear 6th, and then that is the point of exhaustion from the point that it shows up to the end of the series, most likely. I don't think we're going to go beyond that, because we haven't really explored Gear 5th to its fullest, nor has there really been an opponent to push Gear 5th. The closest thing that we have seen are the Gorosei, and that was a weird stalemate, because even though they didn't necessarily put Luffy down, he couldn't put them down either. So it's weird. It's not, Gear 5th isn't being pushed. It's just that Gear 5th can't overcome the wall that is the Gorosei. It's a very weird way in how that was structured, because technically he's not losing against them. He just can't put them down. And from what we see from them and from what Luffy says about Gear 5th in Wano, I think that is his peak. But the peak as far as Devil Fruit powers are concerned. Like, as far as the Devil Fruit journey goes, this is it. Anything else, like, for example, Gear 4th being cannibalized by the base set, is just personal growth. It's personal growth. Now we're talking about Haki control. And then I would say, too, Gear 4th being cannibalized as well is a journey in controlling his Haki. Because now he's using his Haki more responsibly, focusing it on the limb that he chooses to imbue with the muscle balloon technique, as opposed to expanding it across his entire body. So it makes sense narratively that this is the point of growth. But to continue, I still think that Gear 6 is the next step, which would be kind of like a weird, it's a form, but not a form kind of thing, like how Gear 4th was. Because it would just be Gear 5th with the Haki application of Gear 4th. So in that way, I guess it's just, in a way, controlling the chaotic nature of Gear 5th and designating particular forms to have a particular way of doing things, and then stance changing from one form to another. It doesn't even necessarily have to be the same 3 forms. There could be 5 forms instead of 3. Because it was always weird that Gear 4th only had 3 forms. That was weird too. So, hey, there could be 5 stances that Gear 5th has, and he just switches between the 5 of them in Gear 6. So, to reiterate, if Gear 6 goes the way of Gear 4th, maybe there'll be 5 to 6 forms. Or it could just be 3 to simplify it. So maybe 3 to 6 forms, perhaps, that Luffy stance changes between. So there could be a variation like Bound Man. There could be a variation like Snake Man. There could be a variation like Tank Man. But I think that's where we're going, because the point now is to use Conqueror's Haki offensively and defensively. I think that's where we're going, because that's where we left off with Kaido. How some techniques, like I mentioned a little earlier, how we had Hydra and Rock Gun, how those things are just other techniques that we've seen previously, but now imbued with Conquerors. So I think that's going to be sort of like the flavor of the day as we move forward. But with that being said, yeah, I just wanted to talk about this cannibalization of Gear 4th and how cool it is as a development in the story. So with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Paula Pete What's It.